Every new Far Cry comes with a string of render-side upgrades, and last year's Far Cry 5 made a mark with Junior Engine's new lighting. The materials were on point, and while the series may not be the most cutting edge today, it's still a gorgeous game just to look at. Now, Ubisoft gives us Far Cry New Dawn. Just like Primal, this is a smaller scale release until the next numbered sequel arrives. Basically, it takes the best of Far Cry 5's feature set, reworking the Hope County area of its map into a new adventure, is bigger than a DLC installment, and gives the team a second shot at using this latest junior revision, where base Xbox One was apt to struggle in holding 30 FPS. Has anything improved? Let's find out. The first point here is this game still looks stunning. Hope County's landscapes are in a state of super bloom, filling it out with this dense, rich swathe of flourishing plant life. It's always been a mainstay of this series to showcase heavy pockets of plants and trees to sneak around, and it's back. It's not purely static either. Long grass bends as you walk past, and smaller trees snap as you drive through. Though for the most part, a woodland is still filled with immovable structures you'll just smash into. Again, the downside is the Far Cry series fixes so much of its geometry in place, with little in the way of object destruction physics. It looks great, but the complexity of its world can at times be limited. With that said, there are parts which work brilliantly. Here's Xbox One X in action at a native 4K. At a surface level, it starts on its best foot, with a jaunt down a sparkling river flanked by wildlife. All geometry is reflected using the team's screen space approach, a selective form of it that includes the trees and mountains but no alpha effects. In other words, you'll catch AI or wildlife being mirrored, but you get nothing for explosions or gunfire. Even on X hardware, it's not a complete solution for SSR, but it still works well enough in calmer moments. Oh, and to top this scene off, there's that beautiful lens flare effect too. It's gorgeous. The fire propagation system is back too, stemming all the way from Far Cry 2, which lets flames spread slowly across dry grass. Hope County is one of the best looking areas to feature in a Far Cry game, but it wouldn't be much fun if you couldn't leave some mark on it. This is still the most dramatic way to affect the landscape, and gives you an extra strategy for herding AI into a space without them ever seeing you. It's a feature that's rare to see in a game, and it makes the modern day Far Cry stand out for that reason. So yes, the production may be smaller than what I'd expect from Far Cry 6, but it's still a looker. In typical Ubisoft style, facial and motion capture are of high quality, at least for the major cutscenes at the start. The effort put into the material work on characters is tremendous, and the capture tech is powerful enough to let the actors have some fun with their roles. It looks natural above all, but never hyper-real, and so it doesn't veer towards the uncanny valley. Sadly, character animations during gameplay are less laboured over from a dev standpoint. Lip sync is low quality and clearly a cut below New Dawn's opener. They're just functional and a clear sign of corners being cut. New Dawn, it's fair to say, takes many of both the pros and cons from Far Cry 5's visual design on console. The template is set in stone, essentially, and that goes for the res metrics of course. Until now, it's been Xbox One X footage running at 3840 by 2160 natively, with no signs so far of dynamic res changes. Next up is the Ps4 Pro running at 2880 by 1620, which repeats the trick of Far Cry 5, where each axis is cut to 75% of a full 4K. Backed by the team's TAA solution, I still think this looks lovely on an Ultra HD set, but I know which I'd pick. New Dawn is a game that benefits more than most from even incremental bumps in res. The foliage detail is so fine and stretches out so far, these numbers do start to matter. The base consoles are a great example again of why resolution matters. PS4, a full 1920 by 1080 there, an exact pixel match for a 1080p screen. It's a significant upgrade over the base Xbox One though, which again runs at 1440 by 1080. In this case, it's just a chop on the horizontal axis, but it's enough for Xbox One's rendering of the wilderness to look muddier and scaled. Really, often it's not such a big issue in other games, but it stood out to me in New Dawn. X hardware is clearly the ideal way to play, and frankly I'm amazed we're getting such a sky-high resolution without too much issue. Any other visual differences besides that though? That's the catch. In comparison, even this generation's most powerful system has some pitfalls. Take the object pop-in for rocks for instance. On base Xbox One you can see stones on the riverbed popping in clusters just a few meters ahead. Sure, you could argue the lower resolution hides it better, but it shows room for improvement on a more powerful box. Switch over to the X model and what do we find? Well, it's the same issue all over again, popping across the floor. It's not a pervasive issue for the game overall, but it's a drawback that could have been addressed. Surprisingly, shadows are also very similar. Self-shadowing from characters looks extremely poor on all systems up close, even Pro and X models. In the open world they look fine, but I especially expected better from X in the interiors. You get a dithered flickering effect like this, and it's really not a massive difference next to their base machines. Now with that said, X hardware does show extra shadowing in this initial river area, on the wood to the left. It's possible it gets a bump in shadow preset there. Even Pro doesn't match it, but otherwise everything else is the same. There are so many moving parts in New Dawn to consider too. Each setting, from the SSR to the volumetrics at night, are impressively handled in isolation, but when you see the minor differences between base and enhanced machines, you do wonder if there could have been more value added. I'd argue the jump to 4K on X is well worth the commitment of GPU resources for the console. It's totally part of X's mission statement, and it delivers. But an optional 1080p mode with better settings could have been a great alternative. Just like Far Cry 5, there's limited custom tailoring besides that final output res, and New Dawn gave the team a fresh chance to try some new ideas out here. Perhaps for Far Cry 6 we'll see the boat pushed out further, but this time just 4K and 1620p for Pro will do. One of the staples of Far Cry's CPU and GPU budgeting on console is locking to 30 FPS. It's not necessarily a CPU taxing game, destruction physics are minimal, and the most intensive aspect of its design there is sending draw calls to stream in these eye-catching assets. Junior Engine is ultra streamlined in this respect. It feels supremely well equipped for modern consoles, with a focus on surface level detail that scales neatly to every machine. But with that said, Far Cry 5 didn't always run perfectly, especially once we got to the base consoles. Needless to say, X hardware comes out rather well here. 30 FPS is locked mostly, barring a little tearing on very rare occasions. But the lock to a half refresh is so consistent otherwise, it's hard to knock it. Likewise for my playthrough on Ps4 Pro, it doesn't matter if you're running through a thicket or taking on a group of AI in geometry dense environments, it's all in its comfort zone. The other relief is, it's all evenly frame paced, and overall the input lag between a controller input and the response on screen is low. For a 30 FPS game, it's about as good as you can expect. Perhaps motion blur might have mitigated some of the judder. It's something that can stand out when you're panning around during the on-reel section later, but other than that, 30 FPS is a reasonable target and well met. There is a sense base PS4 is the focal point for optimizing at 30 FPS. It's 1080p and carries many of the same visual settings as the enhanced consoles, all while locking to 30 FPS too. The biggest and most taxing firefight I've found is outside this base, filled as it is with these enemies and conveniently placed explosives. On PS4 there's nary a blip in action, it's just rock solid and I don't have any complaints. The same can't be said of the base Xbox One though, which again shows PS4 may have been the focus of development with the other machine playing catch up. So what's the score on Xbox One? Well, just like with Far Cry 5, this is where the dips become more intrusive. It's not so much that it drops under 30 FPS as it is the fact it tears up and down the screen. We're looking at a big settlement, and just the sight of it kicks that adaptive VSync into gear. You get drops to 28 FPS or so, nothing too overwhelming. However, it forces frames out even if they're only partially complete, and it does become a distraction. Most developers draw the line at screen tear right at the top to minimize visibility, but here it's right in your line of sight, cropping those vertical lines in half. Xbox One's performance reminds me a little of Far Cry games from last generation. On PS3 and 360, we had a similar full screen tear in Far Cry 3 that could ruin the image, though it was far more severe in that case. At least here it only crops up in big battles, and for the rest of play it's 30 FPS. No change from Far Cry 5 setup in other words. Even the drop to 1440 by 1080 isn't enough to sidestep performance drops, but from what I've seen, this series has been much worse in its time. It's a shame for this console, but still very playable. As the four consoles stand, it's another sign base Xbox One isn't the focus early in development, and we're looking at base PS4 at minimum for a stable frame rate. Far Cry New Dawn is a stopgap, but at least it's a beautiful stopgap. If you're a fan of the series and want a wholesome encore to Far Cry 5, this game has you covered. The template of chasing objectives, upgrading to new weapons, and slowly conquering the map stays in place, and fundamentally, so does the junior tech. For a more radical leap, it looks like we'll have to hang tight until Far Cry 6 to show us where the series will push to next. That's about all I have for this one, but I hope that covers the bases. If it did, you can support our work at DF by liking or subscribing to the channel. And if you do, be sure to hit the bell to get notifications as any video lands. Check out our Patreon for the 4K source file to this video, and to get in touch directly, just use Twitter. But for now, thanks for watching.
Okay then, just hear what I gotta say, please. As I was saying, I was one of Bean's scouts. Okay, fine. I'm sorry. Help me! Oh God!